I'm Ashton Verdery. I'm an assistant professor at Penn State. I kind of do social networks and health and demography. And what I wanted to talk about today is RDS, and I wanted to kind of lead in with a soft lead about why you would want to sample from a network or like use a social network to sample, and then maybe some conceptual challenges that you're going to encounter when you're doing it off the bat. And then I'm going to kind of, after introducing the general idea, I'm going to really get into the depths of RDS-related work and kind of deal with some of the pitfalls that people encounter, some recommendations for how to do it, and then I'm happy to take questions. Last time I presented this last year, I brought like 3 presentations worth of material, and I could have gone for like 3 hours. So I actually rewatched what I brought last time, and I kind of cut down, so I hopefully won't speed through as much, but I may have cut down too much. So it'll be an interesting calibration exercise. So please. Actually, that was my main goal, yeah, to look good by comparison. All right, so I just grabbed this image of a snowball sample off of Google, but I think it's a kind of helpful way to begin thinking about this. It is a very tantalizing prospect that you could take one person and they will bring 2 new people into the sample, and each of them will bring 2 new people into the sample. And this has been enchanting statisticians, sociologists, and other people for decades, since at least the 60s. This idea that you could leverage social ties to recruit more and more people into your sample is a really powerful idea that has numerous times reared its head, and everyone says, this is fantastic, look at what we can do with this. And then about 5 years later, it gets shot down again. And respondent-driven sampling has gone through a period of receiving a lot of criticism and is still holding strong relatively in spite of that, which I think makes it a particularly exciting method. One thing I want to emphasize with this is these kind of approaches and some of the intuition about respondent-driven sampling can inform lots of data collection procedures outside of traditional kind of respondent-driven sampling. I think that the intuition is very helpful when thinking about qualitative samples, for instance, where you do kind of a snowball-like process. And so there might be stuff here for people who aren't going to do RDS that would be worthwhile to think about. I think this will complement a lot of what Jimmy talked about earlier with respect to kind of the blended partial approach between ego network data collection and saturated network data collection. So when I talk about this, I like to talk about how I really think that these kind of how to sample questions are at the absolute center of methodological and even substantive research within all of the social sciences. I think that new ways to sample are fundamental to our continued ability to viably study human populations. There's new populations of interest that are continuing to kind of be of interest to people. These include undocumented migrants have become a very important topic in recent years, including drug users and other groups at high risk of HIV, which has traditionally been of very high interest to the public health community. But there are other groups like refugees and others that are new populations that haven't traditionally been studied by kind of standard survey protocols. And I think as the social sciences have moved away from just being focused on kind of nationally representative data, we've become very interested in kind of understanding subpopulations in depth. And I think that these methods help to kind of move us more towards studying those groups. I think one of the biggest kind of elements of this that's really interesting for people in the networks field is this idea that we have all these new methods, like social network methods, for testing theories about migrant transnationalism, about spread of infectious diseases, and other things like that. And with those kind of new tools and new theories and kind of new approaches, we need the data that would actually be able to inform them. You can't do much with a simple random sample of the US population in terms of social network data analysis. You can do some ego network stuff, but even that can be quite limited. And so having kind of this network-based, having more network data is always a good thing, I think, to networks people. And then last, I think there's this existential threat that social scientists don't talk about enough in terms of declining survey participation rates. Without overstating it, I think that there is, to some extent, all groups are becoming hidden populations, and it's important for us to think about new ways to collect data other than random digit dialing kind of approaches or knocking on doors that might overcome some of these response rate challenges. To To illustrate this survey participation problem, this is the graph of response rates to Pew surveys starting in the late 1990s. And if you go back further, it's a little bit higher. But they're talking about how excited they are that survey response rates have bottomed out. They are no longer declining, which is, I suppose, good, right? That it's bottomed out at 9%. But when your survey when 9% of the people you contact participate in the survey, that is a potential for huge biases in kind of polling and kind of opinions and things like that. So survey methods, I think, that can yield higher response rates or alternate approaches to data collection are really at the forefront of reinvigorating kind of social science research that most of us do. Most of the work on respondent-driven sampling is focused on this concept of hidden populations, which are groups that are very difficult to sample without with the traditional kind of sampling approaches. And generally they're considered that way because there's no sampling frame for them. There's no list of people that I could say, take every 10th person on that list and sample them, or take a random set of those people and sample them. They're difficult to survey because even if there is a list, which there rarely is, they tend not to be willing to respond because of stigma, because they don't trust the survey researchers, or because they're extraordinarily rare. Undocumented groups from particular region in Mexico that have moved to North Carolina might be a very difficult population to survey, just because they're so rare. You could go and knock on every household and take only the ones that fit this criteria and survey them, but that's an incredibly expensive process to engage in. A kind of alternate way of thinking about it, this is a sample of a slum that was taken in Lilongwe, and they were really interested in knowing what are the characteristics of these residents of this slum in Malawi. And so to survey them, they came up with a very innovative approach to doing it. And they put dots on every roof of the slum, and then they sampled the dots. So they sort of reconstructed like a household sampling frame. In the absence of addresses, they used kind of geospatial data to reconstruct a household sampling frame. But I think the hidden populations that respondent-driven sampling applies to are typically ones that, that even that much information is not available. There's no roofs that you can put dots on and sample people. The traditional ways that these groups are sampled, for the longest time, it was basically just convenience samples. Can we get anyone from this population to talk to us? And can we use the survey data from them to learn anything of interest, even if it may not be generalizable to kind of the broader population of interest? That was the traditional way. In the kind of through the 70s to the 90s, clinical samples became a very popular method, particularly for drug-using populations. And this would be like Suboxone treatment clinics and other needle exchange programs. And they would survey people who come in to exchange needles or come in for treatment to these programs. The challenge with that is that there's this wide range of people that are not affiliated or don't participate in the treatment program who may be very different from the people who do. And therefore, you're kind of missing the general kind of population of injection drug users, for instance. The other method that has been quite successful is location-based samples. This includes the place method, which is developed at UNC, and then time-location sampling, where you might say, you kind of know the locations that the homeless in San Francisco sleep at night. And so you kind of make a map of those locations, and then early in the morning you go and survey people as they're waking up in those specific locations. The challenge with the location samples is lots of people move and don't have kind of fixed locations that they reside, but also that they tend to be extraordinarily expensive and can put real challenges for the researcher going into kind of communities. Going into like homeless encampments and things like that can be risks for researchers that need to be weighed against sort of the possibility of doing the survey. The big problem with all three of those kind of traditional approaches is this question of whether we're learning about people who are not participating in the sample. One thing that I think is really challenging is this kind of idea of inference to a larger population. You maybe want to know about the 10,000 homeless people who live in Raleigh-Durham rather than the 300 that you talk to, right? And it's very difficult to infer to that population unless you have some sort of probabilistic kind of sampling frame from which you've drawn individuals. And then last, most of these methods, particularly location samples, are very time intensive and very costly. and they tend to yield samples that are very small. I think the median size of the time location samples that I've looked up is 120 cases, which is very small and very difficult to make inferences from that. So sort of into this void of methods, responder-driven sampling kind of emerged in the late 1990s, and it was really a reinvention of the kind of traditional snowball sampling approaches where individuals would recruit as many of their peers as they could. The key innovation of RDS was that they would limit the number of people each person can recruit, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I guess the main thing is the original method was proposed in 1997 by Doug Heckathorn, and it really relied on kind of some core sociological principles, including the idea that people are linked in a network, and also that you can leverage certain elements of like social relations to get people to recruit other people, which I'll come back to in a second. So it's actually a very popular method. I updated this slide the other day. When I presented last year, I had updated it shortly before, and I could only find 420 studies last year, and now it's 512. There's been more than 1,100 papers published using responder-driven sampling data, compared to last year where it was 640. Those papers have been cited more than 20,000 times, whereas last year it was 11,000. And now it's gotten over $200 million of funding from the NIH, so it's a very popular kind of sampling method. I guess one way I thought about, like, could you compare it to like another network analytic method? So I said, okay, egocentric designs are a really popular network method, and there's much more research on RDS kind of studies than egocentric studies, where 230 studies since 1990 have been funded that have done egocentric work. So this is a very, very core method. These are the number of papers that have been published in RDS, and you can see it's just kind of continuing to grow very rapidly. There are a number of kind of applications to RDS. Given that there have been 600 plus studies that have been funded by the NIH that have used this method, it's kind of challenging to characterize all the applications of it, but I think the most common ones are these top three: men who have sex with men, people who inject drugs, commercial sex workers. Those are really the core RDS studies. Most of them have looked at those groups because they're at highest risk of HIV and HCV transmission. High-risk heterosexuals and other drug-using populations tend to be kind of a common group that's studied as well because opioids and things, methamphetamines, these kind of recent crises have received a lot of attention. They've been getting a lot of responder-driven samples collected. But there's been more interesting, or very interesting, kind of other ones, including vegetarians, jazz musicians. I saw one about wheelchair users, which I thought was very interesting. So there's lots of kind of different populations to which this has been applied. The typical questions that are used when people begin running an RDS, first is, can we just sample this population? Like, that's always going to be the first barrier that you're going to encounter when you're running an RDS study, is like, can you get people to participate? And if you've run one, you're going to find that sometimes it doesn't always work. Second, people often begin to ask questions about the characteristics of the population beyond the sample. Can we say something about what is the HIV prevalence of drug users in Lilongwe or in New York City or other places? And then kind of another application that I'm not going to talk about as much, but is becoming increasingly common, is what's the size of the population? A number of RDS studies have begun to use these network scale-up methods that Jimmy briefly introduced to kind of estimate how many people are there that fit this population's criteria, which you can imagine from like a public health decision-making context can be very important. If you know that the size of the commercial sex worker population in one city is much larger than the size in another city, you might distribute kind of interventions differently on the basis of kind of just sheer population size issues. So that's another one, but I'm not going to talk about it as much. RDS, as I mentioned, is kind of very large endeavor, but I took the Web of Science data and tried to kind of use their criteria to say, like, what are the major areas in which RDS research is being done? And clearly the biggest one is public health, right? Infectious diseases, this is most of the HIV research, so those two are really kind of very similar areas. But there are a number of people using kind of for standard social science kind of research and for psychiatric research. What's missing from this, I think, and one of the real limitations from it from like a user's perspective, is that there's not as much stuff in the statistics or sociology, like these groups that have a lot of methodological insights into network analysis and things like that, those are not making huge inroads in terms of, like, it's not a rapid area of methodological development. There's a couple, 30 or 50 methodological RDS papers a year, but they're not as quickly as it's being deployed in the field. And I think there's a little bit of a disjuncture there that could be beneficial if more people would work on the methodological aspects of it. The core idea of RDS, I mentioned that when it came out in the 90s, it was sort of a rehash of earlier snowball sampling methods. The two major innovations were this chain referral peer recruitment element, which existed in snowball samples, but they really started limiting the number of people that each person could recruit, trying to make the chains go longer rather than wider. And to do that, they would recruit like a group of seed participants, give them each 2 coupons, and then limit the number of people that could be recruited by each person who participates in the study. Typically, another big part of it is that they would incentivize people to recruit other people. So you would get compensated for participating in the survey yourself and for recruiting others into the survey. So if I were to refer Peter Mucka into the survey, then I could go back later and collect an additional incentive if he were to participate, which adds that like slight element of social pressure that I might say, hey, Peter, have you gone and participated yet? Which tends to yield much quicker recruitment dynamics than otherwise. And basically, this process just keeps repeating until till the sample size that you wanted is attained. One of the kind of features of it in the field that really differs from a lot of the statistical theory is this idea that nobody participates more than once. You don't want to get into a situation where I recruit Jim to participate, and then Jim recruits me to participate, and then I recruit Jim to participate, because that's like, you're going to end up with an N of 2, and it's going to be kind of a useless sample, but Jim and I would make quite a bit of money. Yeah. And a big part of it is that researchers lack control of the sampling process. The name Respondent-Driven Sampling was chosen deliberately. It is really driven by the respondents. Who they go out and recruit and how they get individuals into the sample is really driven by them. That has a lot of implications in terms of it becomes impossible to calculate traditional response rates, for instance, because you don't know every person that the respondent contacted to participate in the survey. So there's a lot of limitations that arise because the respondent drives it. But it also creates opportunities because these are populations that normally wouldn't talk to researchers, coming and saying, I would like you to participate in a survey. They might not be willing to do it, but if their friend or peer asks them to, they might be much more willing. The second big innovation of the early RDS work was this kind of reweighting of cases after the data was collected. So they adjust for a theoretical sampling model that should, in theory, in a network, govern how likely people are to be in the sample, which means that you can say that that one case relative to another is more or less likely to be in the sample, which helps a lot in terms of gaining inference on the general population. Responder-driven sampling is typically initiated with this group of people called seeds, who are usually selected by convenience sample. This is definitely where the art rather than the science comes in. There are recommendations about selecting seeds, but they vary very extensively across different kind of manuals. Some recommend picking people that don't know each other. Others recommend picking people with different attributes, and yet others recommend picking people that are very popular. I think some mix of all of those is true, but it's often very difficult to identify the seeds, which is the whole reason that you decide to use RDS in the first place, right? So in general, prioritize people that don't know each other, people that are more popular, and that are diverse in terms of their key attributes. For instance, with injection drug users, you might be interested in prioritizing individuals who have been injecting for different periods of time, or maybe who inject in groups versus solo and things like that. So you recruit, typically the recommendation for offline RDS is to recruit 7 to 10 seeds and to give them the coupons, and then you ask them to distribute the coupons to others. A core feature of the coupons is that you want to uniquely code them so you can know both who you originally gave it to and then who later showed up at the survey site with the coupon. And you don't let people who don't have a coupon participate unless they're a seed. So this is sort of a way to kind of force the network to actually force the sample to operate through the network. And there's some work on non-physical coupons, including online stuff. I have a slide at the end about this, but it's a very open area of research, and there's a lot of challenges for online kind of network sampling. I wanted to highlight some of the key elements on the coupons. This is from a project, this is not my project, in Thailand, I believe, where they were looking to recruit individuals. And typically, you create these coupons, you give them to the respondents, and then they give them to other people. So you want to have really core things. Typically, you have information about the study and about the informed consent procedures. In this particular case, it's on the back of this card. You always want like a way to contact the research team. Often RDS studies give a valid date for coupons so that they don't end up with the study closing down the study and then there's a bunch of coupons sitting in the field and people feel like they should have been able to redeem them and they couldn't. So you often give a valid date so it's clear to the participants when sort of the coupon or when the study would end. You often want to give like an actual location of the interview site so that respondents will know where they go to participate. And then lastly, this tracking code. So you know who you initially gave it to and then who ended up redeeming it. When you run an RDS study, you typically get data that looks like this. This is from Giovanna's study in Luzhou in China of commercial sex workers. And you get this data where you have these 7 initial seeds at the top here, and some people don't recruit anyone, like this individual here. And other people, this person recruited 2. I think there's one who only recruited, no, there's none who recruited 1. But you get this kind of initial seeds, and then those people recruit additional people, who then recruit additional people, and you get this kind of like branching, tree spreading process. It's very often the case that some of the kind of groups of people end up being much more successful in recruiting the total number of cases than others, or than kind of more smaller chains, they're called. So that's one thing that can really be an important element to look out for when you're doing this in the field, is that you might have 2 or 3 that don't seem to be working, but then typically 1 or 2 of the chains will really take off and hit a large part of the network. Another element of the RDS data that I wanted to bring up, this is a graph made by Jake Fisher and Giovanna, where they graphed the recruiting people by what tier of sex work they were engaged in. So you have kind of non-venue based people who are on the street, and then kind of lower tier individuals, and then higher tier individuals who work in high-end hotels and things like that. And you can really just visually see this kind of, it tends to recruit people, or people tend to recruit people who are similar to them, right? That there is this kind of pattern of like, I believe Jake called it stickiness in this. And that's a common pattern that you see in RDS studies. Another common pattern that you see is that it tends to sample the middle of the network. This is a social network. I simulated an RDS on it. I actually started with this node up here. And the black nodes are the ones that get actually sampled in the simulated sample. And you can see like it pretty rapidly gravitates towards like what a network index would tell you is the center of the network or the core of the network. And that's a really common feature that gets directly adjusted for by most of the respondent-driven sampling weighting methods. Sort of in the same vein, this is from Jim and Giovanna's work. This is the kind of simulated RDS network, and then they simulated thousands of RDSs on that network. And you can see, and these people are located by actual geographic locations because they had sampled enough people that they could say like, here's how the simulated network would look in geographic space, and here's how the ties between individuals look. And then they simulated RDSs on it, and you can see that it tends to oversample kind of central points in the geographic space as well. And this is kind of a common feature of RDS, that it will sample geographically and socially kind of central areas. I brought this slide mostly for your kind of future, like you could use it at home. I feel like it's not enough time in a 50-minute talk to really go through the details of how to use all these different RDS data sets, but I wanted to kind of highlight some of their potential utility. So one of the really nice things, there's a useful website by Mark Hancock and collaborators where they've really collected all sorts of just very helpful data about how to run feasibility studies for RDS, how to do some of the methodological stuff about weighting. I think it has a wiki with questions and answers for that you can search. People have asked, I had this problem or that in the past. There's a number of manuals for RDS survey design. I think that these are particularly useful, including the WHO one by Lisa Johnson, and there's a CDC one as well. And these really go through like planning and implementing RDS studies, including elements of IRB, suggested consent procedures, and things like that I think will be very useful if you're actually planning to run one. And also they have like nice forms for tracking the coupons and things like that. There's a number of different software packages available. There's a package in R called RDS that's probably the most commonly used by statisticians at this point, and it really plays very well with the kind of standard R network packages, including SNA and iGraph and StatNet and other ones. There's the most common one used by public health individuals as this program written by Doug Heckathorn called RDS Analyst. It's a standalone program for both coupon management and computing RDS weights. One of the things that has lots of weights that you can then take and then export to use in statistical software programs that you might be interested in. There's also some Stata packages by, I think it's I'm not going to remember his name. So there's some Stata packages out there. Jake Fisher has I think the best step-by-step guide for visualizing RDS chains. Usually, they vary a lot in their quality of visualization, but he has a great one for how to do it in Payek. So I would suggest getting in touch with him. And then last, there's a number of kind of new packages coming out regarding diagnostic methods for RDS, like when you've run the sample or while you're running it, can you tell if it's working well, which I would point you to. So as with any sampling method, there are kind of assumptions with RDS, and when those assumptions are met, it tends to do well, and when they're not met, it tends to do poorly. So there's a baseline assumption that is absolutely critical. It's not going to work otherwise. That no person is an island, right? That the individuals in the population know each other, and that they'd be willing to refer other individuals in the population into the survey. I think that for most people interested in social networks, I think we can generally assume that that is true in a lot of cases, but it certainly won't be true in all cases. You can imagine if you're interested in commercial sex workers and Johns, there might be a real barrier between referrals there that might not occur. There's also a number of other assumptions here, including that the population size exceeds the sample size by a large amount, that kind of dyadic homophily is weak between individuals, that the community structure is not incredibly modular. Typically that the graph has, or that the social network has like one giant component. Jimmy talked earlier about you might have a limitation that if you start in like one group, you can only sample individuals that are ultimately in that kind of connected component. In RDS, it's the same idea, but they usually assume that there is sort of a giant component in the network, which I think is not a terrible assumption. There's other things about the population size is known, or all ties are reciprocated. Some of these are needed for some estimators, and some of them are not needed for others. There's also a number of key concepts about RDS that I think are useful for thinking through, and I'm going to talk through them kind of independently because I think that they're very helpful when you begin to think about planning and implementing an RDS study. And as I mentioned, the different estimators that you would compute all have strengths and weaknesses, and they make different assumptions. And I think that's one of the really nice things about RDS is as it's statistically developed, some of the things that originally were assumed have been like discarded, which is kind of a nice feature. But sometimes you can't collect all of the data that would do that. For instance, the original assumption that RDS was sampling without or sampling with replacement process is no longer needed when you use when you have a known population size, because you can use a particular estimator that deals with the without replacement process. I thought that this graph is pretty helpful when you think about how it looks on paper versus how it looks in the field. At the end of the day, you usually graph something that looks like this, that this respondent recruited these people in wave 1 who recruited those people in wave 2, right? But what's actually happening in the population is a little bit different than that, and really is going to be different in the field, and I think provides room for new estimators to be developed. What actually occurs in the population is this person maybe recruits person B at time 2, and then a couple days later recruits person C. Even though they're graphed at the same wave right here, there's actually a temporal lag between when they're recruited. Similarly, the other kind of dynamics. And that's what's actually going on in the sort of, for the respondent's perspective in terms of who's recruiting whom. But there's another element of what the researcher sees in terms of like back at the research site when people come in. And I think this is a really useful way of thinking about it, because you have individuals who participate in the survey the first time, they recruit someone else, so A recruits B, and then A actually typically comes back in to collect their incentive for having recruited participant B. That offers the opportunity to re-interview person A about elements of their ties to person B or ties to other people who have participated and other things like that. But that ability to re-interview them and how much of the network they might be able to look back on is going to be pretty staggered by the recruitment process. So I think there's actually a lot more leverage that can be gained about temporal dynamics of ties and things like that that haven't actually been fully exploited. This is a great area for methodological research if anyone's interested. This is this idea of primary and secondary interviews. Another key concept with RDS is that it tends, well, statistically in theory, it yields unbiased results. But the results tend to be highly variable from sample to sample. And there's a real trade-off between biasness and variability that went unrecognized in the RDS literature for a long time, but which is begun to be more recognized and is, I think, a little bit problematic for RDS at this point. You can imagine having something that's very biased, like if you were to run 1 million samples, and plot their histogram, that the peak of the distribution is far away from the population parameter. Or you can imagine something that's like unbiased but has a lot of variance, for instance this one here, where the peak of the distribution is approximately around the population parameter, but that each individual sample tends to be far away from it. And there's maybe a trade-off between those two, that having kind of more consistent results versus more variable results could be beneficial to be a little bit biased when the results are more consistent. I have another slide that I think will clarify this pretty well. Yeah, so to illustrate that idea, I made this, this video that's coming up. This is like a set of simulations that I ran. I ran 500 responder-driven samples on this population, and I ran 500 simple random samples on the population. The population here is that Project 90 network that I showed earlier, and the red nodes here are non-white individuals in the network, so you can see it's kind of pretty structured kind of social network of high-risk heterosexuals in Colorado Springs in the early 1990s. This is just a baseline test network. The basic properties are replicated, and you could replicate this in many networks. So I wanted to estimate like what % of the network is white by running RDS samples and running traditional simple random samples. So I did 150 individuals. I took a 10 seed, 3 coupon RDS. I pretended that people recruit in an unbiased fashion without replacement. And I took a standard simple random sample, except that I made it without replacement to kind of make the two a little bit more comparable. So if I took one sample from the population, just take the first one that I did, and I plot their values. The RDS value is here. The simple random sample value is actually almost exactly on the population of interest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take more and more samples and plot them in the histogram as I take more samples. So this is the sample mean of sample 1 for the RDS, sample mean of sample 1 for the simple random sample. And here I'm hoping this will work. There we go. So if I take each one and I plot the mean of the sample over time, I'm going to do 500 of them in a row. You can see that the simple random sample means tend to be really bunched right around the population parameter of interest. The RDS sample means are unbiased, right? But they're much more variable. Like each RDS sample mean has a much higher probability of being out, 10, 20% away from the true value. And when you're only going to run one sample, that's a huge potential problem for like making an inference, because you're not going to run 1,000 samples and be able to rely on the fact that, oh, like on average, if I run 1,000 RDS samples, it'll be the right answer, because you're only going to run one. And so that's a real limitation of RDS that I think historically had gone unrecognized in the literature.
Ashton, while it's coming back, what is the feature of RDS that's driving that variation?
It's a case dependence. So in a simple random sample, you can assume that each case that you recruit is independent of the next case you recruit. I feel like my mic went off. Is that right? Or can you still hear me okay? Okay. In a simple random sample, you can see each case is independent of the next case. It's the whole nature of it, right? But in RDS, you can't assume that they're independent. So if I recruit someone who is a sociologist, they're more likely to recruit a sociologist than they are to recruit an economist or something like that. Yeah, of course. So I made this as a backup slide in case the video didn't work, but I'm thrilled that it did. And I made another backup slide in case the video didn't work, where I stacked them together. And so this is the SRS. You can see it's much more tightly clustered around the population parameter.
One other question related to that. So when you rolled this out, you showed the overall network you were sampling from the two approaches, that there was the white and black subgroups from that full population, right? So what was the dependence? Because you said that that nomination were made without any bias. Right?
Yes, right. So I will address that in like 2 slides, but the basic answer is that there's bias in terms of like conditional bias, right? And then there's unconditional bias. So like if in that network, a white person is more likely to know a white person, and a non-white person is more likely to know a non-white person. So that's going to introduce a level of dependence into the sampling process. But you can imagine that conditional on who they know, that there's an additional level of bias that gets introduced as well, which is a separate concept that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Just to drive it home, I think that this idea of precision and accuracy is a common one that is seen in lots of statistical applications, but one that doesn't get as much attention because in like traditional statistics, we care much more about bias than precision. But I think with some of these kind of more novel methods, including machine learning kind of approaches, we do care more about the precision. We care more about the biases, or we care more about the precision in a lot of cases than we do just about the accuracy. One kind of interpretable variable that characterizes this the variability of RDS samples from sample to sample is what's called a design effect, which is basically the ratio of the variance of the sampling variance of an RDS study to the sampling variance of a simple random sample. It can be interpreted as like a multiplier of the sample size. So a design effect of 2 would indicate that RDS needs twice as many cases to have the same statistical inference properties as a simple random sample, for instance. And so people have begun to calculate what are the design effects for RDS studies, and they're not good. They are on the range of 5 to 10 is typically what's cited. This is from Golan Salganik's work, where they did a bunch of RDS simulations in the ad health data, as well as in Project 90. They did it on every binary variable in those data sets, and they calculated what is the ratio of the sampling variance of RDS, just like what I had done there. Like what, if you look back at this graph, like what is the spread of this distribution versus the spread of that distribution? And they find that on average it's 5 to 10 times as much, which in practical terms means that if you have an RDS study of 1,000 people, that's like the statistical equivalent of having a simple random sample of 200 people. And so you really need to take that into account, especially when you have an RDS study of, say, 100 people, and then you're looking at a simple random sample of 20 people. These are huge multiplier and limitations that need to be taken into consideration. Another distinction in RDS worth talking about a little bit is this idea of estimates versus parameters. Typically, we think about the estimates as being very similar to the parameters, but in RDS we see huge discrepancies. So one of the clearest examples of this is you have an estimate of the sampling variance, or you might have the confidence interval, or any number of kind of inferential statistics that maybe tell you how confident you should be in your results. And in RDS, those things can differ dramatically from the parameters. Whereas in simple random sampling, if you get a confidence interval, you can kind of believe that if you were to repeat the sample a million times, that the means would fall within that confidence interval 95% of the time or whatever. But in RDS, that's not true. The confidence intervals tend to greatly underestimate the actual sample, the parameters. One of the key concepts in RDS and one of the major weighting factors is what's called degree. I think you've talked about this in the networks group. It's sort of people's popularity. You typically want to know how many incoming ties they have, but because most RDS studies assume that the ties are reciprocated, you can ask people how many people they know and use that in its place. Typically, you would ask, how many people do you know, and you give sort of like what Jimmy was saying. You want to give an actual specific time frame. You want to give a behavioral indicator. You want to give something like you know their name and they know yours, some real way to lock in an actual memory. So these kinds of questions are typically asked and used to weight the data in the end, because the most popular people in the network tend to be the ones that are most likely to be recruited. And there's a number of different kind of weighting estimates that take this into account. I was asked in the back about this idea of recruitment. And so there's a conditionally random and a non-conditionally random recruitment, right? So this person, say you sample this circle A, they know 2 other circles, right? So there's going to be this dependence introduced just from the graph structure, that they're going to be, even if they're equally likely to refer any of their peers, you're going to be 6/9 of the time likely to end up with another circle. Just because of the network structure. But there's another layer to it, that there's this kind of preferential recruitment that kind of builds on top of that and complicates it further, where this person maybe is above and beyond their share of their network ties, more likely to recruit other circles than they are to recruit a square. And that can be a real kind of thorn in the side of traditional RDS assumptions. So we typically distinguish that kind of conditional from non-conditionally random recruitment. And so it's not that we see preferential recruitment because people have more ties to people who are similar to them. It's that above and beyond the ties that they have, they are more like incentivized or some other reason want to recruit people who are similar to them or different from them or whatever it might be. Some examples might be that they have better relationships with people who are more similar to them, or that they really want their friend to get the money. So you might see people who are the highest risk recruited into the study because they want people recruit friends that they really think should get an HIV test because of their risk behaviors or something like that. Only people who are kind of doing riskier things actually accept coupons from people who try and recruit them. So there's all sorts of reasons that this preferential recruitment can be introduced. One thing that's often talked about within RDS studies is this idea of bottlenecks. Peter will talk extensively about community detection approaches. I think it's a much smaller importance than like most other people that do RDS methods do. But I think it's overstated. But the idea that there might be like clusters or communities within the network could create situations that bias recruitment or increase the variance. In general, though, few networks have what really are bottlenecks. Most networks have like this kind of structure, this really modular structure, but there are dozens of ties linking across the kind of communities. And so to me, it seems like it's less of an issue, but some people really worry about this in general. The typical advice when you encounter a situation like this is to to kind of divide the sample into 2 different samples. An example of this is an RDS study in Ottawa. Ottawa is sort of like split between Ottawa, which is in Ontario, and then Hull, which is in Quebec. And they were doing an RDS study of people who inject drugs. And they ended up splitting the study and having one site in Hull and one site in Ottawa. Because the provinces, people didn't cross the provinces. There were language barriers and other things like that. There are lots of different RDS estimators. I think it's too much to really go through all of them, but this should be a slide that has a number of them at least. And point you to some other ones if you want to ask me after. I'm happy to talk about them as well. There are at least 11 that are currently in use that I'm aware of. The most popular one is this Volts-Heckathorn one, which is just a popularity-based weight. But there are other ones that are a little bit more complex that take into account, for instance, the without replacement design, that take into account the other features, including the possibility of preferential recruitment and things like that. There are also several estimators of the sampling variance in use that historically the sampling variance estimators were very poor, but new methods have been developed that really make the estimates much closer to the parameters, which is quite encouraging, including recent stuff derived by Adrian Raftery and Baraf and others, including this tree bootstrap, which seems to be the best method for it. I've tested all the different estimators against each other, or at least 7 of them, and I found that they all have strengths and weaknesses, but the best one is called the Linked Ego Networks Estimator, which is listed here. This is sort of the performance in simulated samples. It tends to yield the best results, but it can't be used in an awful lot of situations that you might care about. So the Linked Ego Networks Estimator is you ask people aspects of their ego network, and then you incorporate that data into your estimate itself. So you might ask, how many of your friends use condoms? And then that informs both the individual, whether or not the individual uses condoms, as well as how many of their friends use condoms. And with both of those, you get much better results than you would without that. Unfortunately, the Linked Ego Networks Estimator, it won't work for certain things like HIV status, because most people don't know their peers' HIV status. But for other things, it maybe could work. Condom use could be one if people talk about it. So there's some limitations to that, but in general, it works quite well. The most common are, as I said, the Voltecathorn estimator or the successive sampling estimator, which adjusts for the without replacement design of RDS. As I said, the tree bootstrap variance estimator seems to be the best. One area of huge development, both from like a practical and a statistical perspective, is I think there needs to be a lot more research on kind of developing RDS for web-based implementation. I think there's great potential to use it for surveying maybe Twitter users or other kind of groups online, but it hasn't been developed as thoroughly as it would need to be. And when you break the need to have a physical location and you can survey on the web, there's a lot of advantages to that. So it could really be a major way to make RDS much more popular method. Having done one web RDS, I can say it doesn't work as well as you want it to. It tends to be very different from the traditional, whereas the traditional method you recommend 7 to 10 seeds. With web-based RDS, you need like 30 to 60 to really get going. There's a huge challenge about respondent verification. Like, how do you know that the person is actually in the population that you're interested in surveying? Are you just going to be paying someone for participation in the survey who you don't actually need their information at all because they're not sample members or target population members?
Can you speak a little more why you need so many more seats?
Yeah, people just don't do it. They just
Okay.
they don't recruit. I mean, that's the simple
They
answer.
don't feel invested in the community the same way like some of the older RDS ones are particularly successful. They do a good job of.
I think it's that, but I think you got to remember that the recruitment is a two-sided process. That I want you to participate, so I give you a coupon, and then you have to also want to participate and go in. And if I just send you an online link, you just delete it. You might ignore that, right? I certainly delete 25 Banana Republic emails or something every morning. So it happens. They over spam you, don't they? And it happens that there's that loss that's a little bit harder. When there's a physical coupon that you have in your wallet, you maybe are a little bit more incentivized, I think, to participate.
What's the trade-off between starting with more or less seeds?
The trade-off is that with fewer seeds, you should think about a trade-off between how deep the chains are versus how wide the chains are. And the deeper the chain, theoretically, the less biased it would be. If you start with 30 random sample seeds, it would be great, but you can't do that. So the closer each case is to the seed, the more likely it is to be biased by the convenience sampling of the seeds. That's the traditional advice. So if you have more seeds, and you only get 4 or 5 waves away from each seed, then that's going to be a real problem for kind of reducing the seed bias in the sample. Does that make sense?
The number of initial seeds, I would expect would have an effect on the variance also. Is there a certain number of seeds that you recruit in order to minimize the variance to some extent?
Yes. So His question is, how does the number of seeds affect the variance? It's actually like, let me talk to you offline about that, because it's a more complicated question than I think I can answer really quickly. Any other questions?
Would one advantage of the web-based one be that you're more likely to actually get 30 or 60 seeds year random because you can get a larger?
Yeah, you can usually get a lot of seeds. I mean, getting a convenient sample is not generally impossible, even for other populations. So yeah, you want to. The problem with the web-based stuff is actually knowing what you know. You want to know whether the respondent's in the target population. You want to know whether the respondent has already participated before. Even that is a tough thing to verify. You could do something like using IP address verification, but that's a real challenge. Like a webcam verification method might be or webcam interview might be a very effective method. But as far as I know, no one has tried that. And then coupon management can be challenging because getting people to redeem secondary incentives is tough online. Lastly, it's always, if you're doing a web-based thing, you have to remember that you're limited to the population that has internet access. We've got very few more slides, so I'll just talk through them. If you do an RDS study in the field, you're probably going to run into problems. There's always like challenges that arise in the field, and you want it to look like this here, where your cases are recruiting other cases, but sometimes it just fizzles, right? And that doesn't, it's not ideal. So the typical recommendations that are given in the case of problems like that is that you expand coupons, so you might add more seeds. You might allow people to recruit maybe 3 or 4 people as opposed to the kind of original number of 2. You might raise the incentives both for participation as a primary interview or for recruiting other people. Or you might reduce the respondent burdens of participation. One big one is maybe have greater emphasis on anonymity. Maybe don't require people to come back in for a secondary incentive. That's like one way to do it. You could shorten the survey, things like that. Those tend to be the typical things that are recommended. If all else fails, you kind of have to rely on the fact that it's a convenient sample, and you could say we have this convenient sample of this population that's tough to survey otherwise, and you can lean on other features of the design that you kind of implemented to begin with.
If you can ask talk about it as well, if all else fails, to what extent is it tolerable to get the researchers more involved in the sampling process?
So to direct people to recruit other people? I think that that's a possible direction. It's going to depend on the case, though. I think depending on what the kind of IRB would let you do and things like that.
Well, besides the IRB, but it also will depend on your ability of recruiting a population. That will depend also on the type of population you are dealing with, right?
Right.
There is, of course, a lot of room for researchers controlling, as you know, right, the sampling process over the network. But that will depend on the tolerance, by the population for this type of interference.
Right. If people aren't willing to recruit others, there's a possibility that you could ask them to give you the contact information, and as the researcher approach those other people. I think depending on the population, that could work very well. I have two more slides. My recommendation is to include with RDS additional data collection efforts. I think that one thing that is really often lacking with RDS studies is that people don't build in these other things that would make it interesting even if the RDS component doesn't work. So one thing that I've had some success with in a current study that I'm really excited about is we've built in an extensive set of qualitative interviews with the respondents. So at the end of the day, if the RDS component doesn't work, we still have these 30 qualitative interviews with respondents, and then a kind of convenient sample that helps to contextualize those qualitative interviews within the broader sample. You could collect minimally identifying information about alters to be able to kind of come up with a blended way to look at actual social network analysis, or you could collect extensive ego network data, like what Jimmy was talking about this morning, to be able to do more interesting kind of data collection, or more interesting kind of statistical and descriptive work on the population. Another thing that is another way to do it is that You can examine things other than just prevalence. I think population size estimates are an interesting question. Network structure questions are interesting. And sort of multivariate models are another way to kind of go beyond the traditional RDS focus on what % of the population has HIV. So RDS has promises and it has a lot of potential pitfalls. In theory, weighting and post-estimation can help you to come up with asymptotically unbiased estimates of the population mean. But to do that, you need to make a number of really unrealistic assumptions, for instance, that no preferential recruitment assumption. They can be difficult to verify assumptions, although there are ways to diagnose some of the problems. And there's some bias even in any case in finite samples. A huge challenge for RDS is that these design effects remain high, that the ratio of the sample sizes for an RDS study versus a simple random sample is typically not very favorable. And you need to keep that in mind that even if you have 1,000 RDS cases, you maybe are working with the equivalent random sample of maybe a couple hundred cases. But I think that at the end of the day, despite that being the case, it's still really exciting because this is data that otherwise wouldn't be collected. I thought about making a third graph earlier when I had the little video of what you would see if you didn't have an RDS study. And so I did actually, I made it right here. You wouldn't see anything about the population, right? You wouldn't have any cases at all. You might have a convenience sample, but there'd be no inferential properties. And I think that is what makes RDS so exciting, is that it's tantalizing that you can get a large number of cases very quickly, cost effectively, and with preserving respondent anonymity of these kind of stigmatized and hard to survey groups. And you can learn a lot about those people, even if some of the basic statistical assumptions aren't met. So thank you very much.
Questions or comments for Ashton?
Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the use of coupons is one of the strategies. I'm just curious about finding maybe these seeds and engaging them in, I know there are consent procedures and issues that would be part of this, of course, but any guidance maybe in your experience of engaging those seeds in the recruitment process or even enrollment?
Yeah, so I think the question is how do you find and engage the seeds in the recruitment process? So I have a study of rural opioid users in Pennsylvania that were collecting data in RDS, and what we did with people was we identified people in halfway houses and clinics in several counties, and we recruited an initial group of people from that, and then we spent a lot of time with it. We have our data person who's doing the most of the data collection is just awesome. She's an ethnographer, and she's so good at quantitative data collection. It's absolutely mind-blowing to me how that ethnographic training really translates into building a rapport with respondents. And so she went over the idea with them, kind of explained, drew out network graphs and kind of explained the idea of snowball sampling and recruitment in general. And that seemed to be a pretty helpful kind of thing to engage people in the basic concept. The other thing is that you typically pay people both for participating. You might say, if you participate in the survey, you get $10, and for each person that you recruit into the survey, you get an additional $5. Does that make sense? Okay. Thank you.